looking at a remote farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills of Nebraska, where the amber waves of grain stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Nobody would expect such a place to harbor one of the most terrifying medical mysteries ever documented. Meet Thomas Garrett, a 62-year-old corn farmer whose calloused hands had worked the same land for over 4 decades, following in the footsteps of 3 generations before him. Thomas lived alone since his wife Martha passed 5 years ago, with only his loyal border collie Rex for company and the occasional visit from his daughter Sarah, who lived 2 hours away in Lincoln. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work, self-reliance, and that most problems could be solved with determination and a good night's sleep. That philosophy would be tested beyond imagination when he first noticed what seemed like an ordinary bruise on his left forearm after moving hay bales on a particularly humid August morning. The mark appeared unremarkable, about the size of a silver dollar, with that familiar purple-blue coloration that comes from bumping into farm equipment or wrestling with stubborn livestock. Thomas barely gave it a second thought, applying some ice and expecting it to fade within a week like countless bruises before it. But this was no ordinary injury, and what would unfold over the next 3 weeks would challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about his own body and push the boundaries of medical science itself. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came exactly 7 days later when Thomas noticed the bruise hadn't faded even slightly. Instead, it seemed to have grown darker and more defined, with edges that appeared almost geometric rather than the irregular borders typical of trauma-related bruising. Standing in his kitchen mirror that Tuesday morning, coffee mug in hand as the first rays of sunlight filtered through gingham curtains, Thomas studied the mark with growing unease. The center had developed a strange firmness, not quite painful but definitely present, like a marble had been placed just beneath his skin. He pressed against it gently with his finger and felt something that made his blood run cold movement. Something inside the bruise had shifted when he touched it, something that definitely shouldn't be there. Thomas had seen plenty of injuries during his decades of farming, from deep cuts requiring stitches to bones broken by ornery cattle, but he had never felt anything like this. The sensation was so unsettling that he immediately called Dr. Harrison, the family physician who had been treating the Garrett family since Thomas was a teenager. Unfortunately, Dr. Harrison was attending a medical conference in Chicago and wouldn't return for another 10 days. His receptionist, Mrs. Coleman, assured Thomas that minor bruising complications were common and suggested he monitor the area while applying warm compresses twice daily. She scheduled him for an appointment the following week, noting in his file that he sounded concerned but not in immediate distress. Thomas agreed to wait, partly because he trusted Dr. Harrison's judgment implicitly and partly because he had 300 acres of corn approaching harvest and couldn't afford to lose time with what was probably nothing more than a stubborn hematoma. But the bruise had other plans entirely. Over the next 72 hours, Thomas watched in growing horror as the mark began to change in ways that defied all logic and medical explanation. The dark purple center started developing what could only be described as veins or channels, thin lines that radiated outward like the branches of a twisted tree. These lines weren't on the surface of his skin but seemed to be growing beneath it, creating a roadmap of something that was spreading through his arm with methodical precision. The firmness he had felt earlier was becoming more pronounced, creating a raised area that felt warm to the touch and occasionally throbbed with its own rhythm, completely independent of his heartbeat. Thomas began measuring the affected area obsessively, using a ruler from Martha's old sewing kit to track its expansion. On Thursday morning, it measured 3 inches across. By Friday evening, it had grown to 4.5 inches, and the strange veining pattern had extended halfway to his elbow. Most disturbing of all, Thomas began experiencing sensations that he struggled to describe to anyone, including himself. It felt as though something was actively moving beneath his skin, not constantly but in periodic bursts of activity that seemed to follow no predictable pattern. Sometimes he would be feeding the chickens or checking fence posts when suddenly he would feel what could only be called exploration, as if something was testing the boundaries of its environment and finding them satisfactory. The psychological impact of these sensations was perhaps worse than any physical discomfort, leaving Thomas questioning his sanity and wondering if isolation was finally taking its toll after years of living alone on the farm. Saturday brought a development that would forever change Thomas's understanding of what was happening to his body. He had risen before dawn as usual to tend to his animals when he noticed that Rex, his normally affectionate border collie, was acting strangely around him. The dog, who typically followed Thomas everywhere and slept at the foot of his bed, was now maintaining a careful distance and seemed agitated whenever Thomas came too close. Rex would whine and back away, his ears flattened against his head in a posture Thomas recognized as fear rather than mere discomfort. Animals possess senses far more acute than humans, and Rex was clearly detecting something that Thomas couldn't perceive with his own limited sensory capabilities. This realization sent waves of anxiety through the farmer as he considered what his loyal companion might be sensing that remained hidden to him. The behavior became more pronounced throughout the day, with Rex eventually retreating to the far corner of the barn and refusing to enter the house at all. By evening, Thomas found himself completely alone for the first time since Martha's death, with even his faithful dog apparently unable to tolerate whatever was happening to him. As he sat in his kitchen that night, rolling up his sleeve to examine the ever-expanding anomaly on his arm, Thomas made a decision that would prove to be both crucial and terrifying. He would document everything with photographs, creating a visual record of whatever was occurring to his body. Using Martha's old digital camera, he began taking detailed pictures from multiple angles, noting the date and time on each image. The first photograph showed an irregular dark mass roughly 5 inches in diameter with clearly visible branching patterns extending in all directions. What Thomas couldn't see in the photograph, but felt with increasing clarity, was that something inside that mass was becoming more active and more organized with each passing hour. The breakthrough moment arrived on Monday morning in a way that no amount of medical training could have prepared Thomas to handle. He had awakened feeling unusually tired, as though he had been active all night despite sleeping soundly, and noticed immediately that the affected area felt different somehow. Where there had been firmness and occasional movement, there was now a sense of pressure, as if something was testing the structural integrity of his skin from the inside. Thomas made his morning coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from the early hour but from an intuition that today would bring answers he wasn't sure he wanted to discover. As he stood at the kitchen sink washing his breakfast dishes, the pressure sensation suddenly intensified dramatically, becoming painful for the first time since the bruise had appeared. The pain was unlike anything in his experience, not sharp like a cut or deep like a muscle strain, but rather a stretching sensation as if something was quite literally trying to break through his skin from within. Thomas gripped the edge of the sink and watched in the reflection of the window as the raised area on his arm began to visibly move, creating ripples across the surface of his skin like something swimming just beneath it. The movement was purposeful and coordinated, not random or chaotic, suggesting an intelligence behind the activity that made Thomas's stomach lurch with revulsion and terror. He stumbled backward from the sink, knocking over a chair in his haste to examine his arm under better lighting. What he saw in the bright fluorescent glow of his kitchen fixture would haunt him for the rest of his life and challenge everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The skin covering the anomaly had begun to thin and stretch, becoming almost translucent in places and revealing shadowy forms moving beneath it with increasing urgency. Thomas could see what appeared to be segmented structures, almost like the body sections of an insect, but far larger than any bug he had ever encountered in 4 decades of farming. These segments seemed to be connected by a network of fine filaments that pulsed with their own rhythm, creating a living web beneath his skin that expanded and contracted in waves of coordinated activity. As Thomas watched in horrified fascination, unable to look away despite his revulsion, he began to understand that whatever was inside his arm was not one creature but many, a colony of some kind that had been growing and organizing itself since that first day he had dismissed the bruise as nothing serious. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was not dealing with any kind of medical condition he had ever heard of, but rather with some form of infestation that had somehow gained access to his body and established itself as a permanent resident. The thought of multiple creatures living inside his flesh, feeding and reproducing and carrying out their incomprehensible activities beneath his skin, nearly caused him to lose consciousness right there in his own kitchen. Thomas grabbed his phone with shaking hands and dialed Dr. Harrison's emergency number, knowing that Mrs. Coleman would probably tell him to wait for the scheduled appointment, but desperate to hear another human voice acknowledge what he was experiencing. The phone call that followed would later be described by Mrs. Coleman as one of the most disturbing conversations she had ever had with a patient, despite 30 years of medical receptionist work that had exposed her to every conceivable health emergency. Thomas's voice was barely recognizable, higher pitched than normal and punctuated by sharp intakes of breath that suggested he was in considerable distress. He struggled to find words adequate to describe what he was experiencing, falling back on agricultural metaphors that only partially captured the horror of his situation. He told Mrs. Coleman that it was like discovering that something had been using his arm as a breeding ground, that there were things moving around inside him that definitely didn't belong there, and that he could actually see them beneath his skin when the light was just right. Mrs. Coleman, trained to handle panicked patients with calm professionalism, initially assumed that Thomas was experiencing some form of anxiety-related symptoms, possibly triggered by isolation and the stress of managing his farm alone. She gently suggested that he might be dealing with a case of formication, a condition where patients feel as though insects are crawling on or under their skin, typically caused by medication side effects, substance abuse, or psychological stress. Thomas became increasingly agitated as Mrs. Coleman offered these explanations, insisting that what he was experiencing was completely physical and visible, not imagined or psychological. He begged her to contact Dr. Harrison immediately, explaining that something was about to happen to his arm and that he needed medical attention within hours, not days. The desperation in his voice finally convinced Mrs. Coleman to interrupt Dr. Harrison's conference activities, leading to a phone consultation that would change the trajectory of Thomas's case dramatically. Dr. Harrison listened to Thomas's account with the practiced patience of a physician who had learned to separate genuine medical emergencies from anxiety-driven health concerns. But something in his longtime patient's voice gave him pause. Thomas Garrett was not prone to panic or hypochondria, having endured numerous farm-related injuries over the years with stoic determination and minimal complaint. For such a man to call in obvious distress, using words like creatures and colony to describe what was happening to his body, suggested that something genuinely unusual was occurring. Dr. Harrison instructed Thomas to take additional photographs immediately and email them to the clinic, where Mrs. Coleman could view them on the computer and describe what she observed. He also advised Thomas to apply a cold compress to the affected area and to avoid manipulating or pressing on the anomaly until it could be examined properly. Most importantly, Dr. Harrison promised to cut his conference attendance short and return to Nebraska the following morning, scheduling Thomas as his first appointment and clearing his entire morning schedule if necessary. This reassurance helped calm Thomas somewhat, but as he prepared to take the requested photographs, he noticed that the pressure sensation in his arm was building to an almost unbearable level, suggesting that whatever was about to happen would occur long before Dr. Harrison could return to help him. The photographs Thomas took that morning would eventually become part of medical literature, studied by specialists around the world who struggled to explain the phenomena they documented. But in the moment they simply confirmed Thomas's worst fears about what was developing inside his arm. The images showed clearly that the skin covering the affected area had stretched to its absolute limit, becoming so thin that individual structures beneath it were visible in startling detail. What Thomas had initially perceived as segmented sections were revealed to be fully formed organisms, each roughly the size of his thumb and possessing characteristics that seemed to combine features from multiple species in ways that defied biological classification. They had elongated bodies with distinct head regions, multiple pairs of appendages that appeared to be legs or manipulative organs, and what looked like sensory structures that moved independently as if constantly sampling their environment. Most disturbing of all, the photographs showed that these creatures were organized in a precise geometric pattern, arranged in concentric circles around a central cluster that seemed to serve as some kind of command center or nexus point. The entire formation pulsed with coordinated movement, expanding and contracting in waves that suggested complex communication and cooperation among the individual organisms. Thomas counted at least 27 distinct creatures in the photographs, though the exact number was difficult to determine due to their constant motion and the layered arrangement of their positioning. As he uploaded the images to send to Dr. Harrison's clinic, Thomas realized that he was documenting something that had probably never been seen before in medical history, a realization that filled him with equal parts scientific curiosity and primal terror about what these things intended to do next. Mrs. Coleman's reaction to the photographs exceeded even Thomas's expectations for shock and disbelief, her professional composure completely abandoned as she viewed images that challenged everything she thought she knew about human biology and parasitic infection. Her first instinct was to assume that the photographs had been manipulated or that Thomas was playing some kind of elaborate prank. But the metadata embedded in the image files confirmed that they had been taken that morning with Martha's old camera, and the quality of the lighting and detail suggested genuine documentation rather than digital manipulation. Mrs. Coleman immediately forwarded the images to Dr. Harrison along with a message marked as urgent priority, then called Thomas back with instructions that reflected the gravity of what she had observed. She told him to avoid any activity that might disturb or agitate whatever was in his arm, to keep the area loosely covered with clean cloth, and to call immediately if he experienced any changes in sensation, movement, or pain level. Most importantly, she arranged for him to be seen that very evening at the emergency room in Lincoln, where Dr. Harrison would meet him after catching the earliest possible flight back from Chicago. Thomas agreed to make the 2-hour drive to the hospital, but as he prepared to leave the farm, events took a dramatic turn that made the journey impossible and thrust him into a medical crisis unlike anything in recorded history. The explosion, for lack of a better term, occurred at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon while Thomas was feeding his chickens in preparation for leaving for Lincoln. He had noticed increasing pressure and movement in his arm throughout the morning, but had managed to control his anxiety by focusing on routine farm tasks and preparing for his hospital visit. As he scattered feed across the chicken yard, Thomas felt a sudden sharp pain followed immediately by a sensation he would later describe as something giving way inside his arm, like a dam bursting or a container splitting under pressure. He looked down to see that the stretched skin covering the anomaly had finally reached its breaking point and torn open along multiple stress lines, creating several small openings through which the contents of the mass were beginning to emerge. Thomas dropped the feed bucket and stared in absolute horror as the first creature pushed its way through one of the tiers, its elongated body glistening with bodily fluids as it freed itself from what had apparently been some form of incubation chamber constructed within his own flesh. The creature was approximately 4 inches long, with a segmented body covered in what appeared to be a hard exoskeleton, 6 legs that ended in sharp points, and a head region that featured compound eyes and mandibles designed for cutting or tearing. It moved with purpose and coordination, immediately orienting itself toward Thomas's face as if recognizing him as either threat or host, its antennae-like appendages twitching as they sampled the air for chemical information. But this first emergence was merely the beginning of what Thomas would later refer to as the most terrifying 5 minutes of his life, a period during which his arm became the site of a mass exodus that challenged his sanity and his understanding of biological possibility. Within seconds of the first creature's appearance, others began pushing through the same opening and creating new tears in his skin, each one working with mechanical efficiency to free itself from the organic chamber that had sheltered and nourished it during its development phase. Thomas watched in stunned paralysis as his arm essentially gave birth to an entire colony of organisms that had been growing inside him for weeks, using his blood, nutrients, and tissue as raw materials for their metamorphosis from whatever they had been when they first entered his body to these fully developed creatures now emerging into the outside world. The process was surprisingly clean, with minimal bleeding despite the multiple tears in his skin, suggesting that these organisms had evolved specifically to minimize trauma to their host during the emergence phase. Each creature that freed itself immediately joined the others in a coordinated movement pattern, organizing themselves into a formation that resembled nothing so much as soldiers preparing for a mission they had rehearsed countless times before. Thomas realized with growing dread that his arm had served as more than just an incubation chamber. It had been a training ground where these creatures had learned to work together, to communicate, and to prepare for whatever they intended to do now that they had gained access to the outside world. The behavioral patterns exhibited by the creatures during and immediately after their emergence provided the first clues about their true nature and origin, though Thomas was far too terrified to engage in scientific observation at the time. Each organism that freed itself from his arm immediately began exhibiting complex social behaviors, touching antennae with others in what appeared to be information exchange, arranging themselves in precise geometric formations, and displaying a level of coordination that suggested either hive mind intelligence or extremely sophisticated communication capabilities. They showed no interest in attacking Thomas or escaping from his immediate vicinity, instead focusing their attention on establishing some form of perimeter or staging area on his arm and the surrounding skin surface. Their movements were purposeful and efficient, suggesting that they possessed detailed knowledge of their environment and objectives despite having been confined within his flesh for their entire existence up to this point. Most unnervingly, Several of the creatures began producing sounds. Not the random noises one might expect from insects or parasites, but organized sequences of clicks and buzzes that had the structured quality of language or coded communication. Thomas found himself listening to what could only be described as a conversation taking place among organisms that had literally been living inside his body, using sounds and patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond that of any parasitic species he had ever encountered. The realization that he had been serving as an unwitting host to intelligent life forms capable of complex communication and coordinated action filled him with a mixture of revulsion and awe that left him frozen in place, unable to flee but afraid to move closer. As the minutes passed and more creatures continued to emerge from the expanding tears in his arm, Thomas began to notice that their behavior was shifting from initial organization to what appeared to be exploration and assessment of their new environment. Several individuals broke away from the main group and began moving along his arm toward his shoulder, while others descended toward his hand, their movements suggesting systematic investigation rather than random wandering. They moved with the confidence of explorers who possessed maps of the territory they were investigating, pausing at specific locations to conduct what appeared to be tests or measurements using specialized appendages that extended from their head regions. Thomas realized with growing horror that these creatures were not simply emerging from his body but were actively studying it, mapping its geography and assessing its suitability for purposes he could only imagine. The systematic nature of their exploration suggested that they possessed knowledge about human anatomy that exceeded his own understanding, moving along nerve pathways and vascular routes with precision that indicated either instinctive knowledge or previous experience with human hosts. When several of the creatures reached his shoulder and began investigating the area around his neck and collarbone, Thomas finally broke free from his paralysis and attempted to brush them away, only to discover that they were far more resilient and determined than their size would suggest. The creature's response to Thomas's attempts to remove them provided the most disturbing revelation about their capabilities and intentions, demonstrating that they were not passive parasites but active agents with defensive capabilities and clear objectives for their relationship with their host. Rather than fleeing when Thomas tried to brush them away, the creatures coordinated their movements to avoid his hands while maintaining their positions on his body, displaying reaction times and tactical awareness that suggested either supernatural sensory capabilities or some form of shared consciousness that allowed them to anticipate his actions. When Thomas became more aggressive in his attempts to dislodge them, several creatures responded by extending sharp appendages that they pressed against his skin in what was clearly a warning rather than an attack, demonstrating both the capacity for violence and the restraint to use it only as a deterrent. Their message was unmistakable. They had no intention of leaving his body and were prepared to defend their position against any attempts at removal. Thomas found himself in the unprecedented situation of negotiating with organisms that had taken up residence in his flesh, creatures that clearly considered him their property rather than their host, and who possessed both the intelligence and the physical capabilities to enforce their claim. The psychological impact of this realization was perhaps more traumatic than the physical manifestation of the infestation itself, as Thomas came to understand that he was no longer the sole occupant of his own body but rather a participant in some form of symbiotic relationship that had been imposed upon him without his knowledge or consent. The truth about what had happened to Thomas began to emerge as he stood in his chicken yard, covered with creatures that had made their home inside his flesh, trying to process the reality of his situation while fighting the urge to panic or flee. The evidence suggested that his initial assessment of the bruise as a simple injury had been catastrophically wrong. What he had dismissed as minor trauma had actually been the entry point for organisms that had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity to gain access to a human host. The systematic way they had established themselves inside his arm, the precision with which they had developed and organized themselves, and the coordinated nature of their emergence all pointed to a level of planning and intelligence that challenged conventional understanding of parasitic behavior. These were not mindless creatures driven by simple biological imperatives, but intelligent beings executing a complex strategy that had been designed specifically to exploit human physiology for their own purposes. Thomas began to realize that he might have been selected as a host not randomly but because of specific characteristics that made him an ideal candidate: his isolation, his tendency to dismiss medical concerns, his distance from immediate medical care, and perhaps other factors that only these creatures could detect and evaluate. The thought that he had been chosen and stalked by intelligent parasites was almost more than his mind could accommodate, forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his own life and the world around him. The final phase of Thomas's ordeal began when he noticed that the creatures were no longer simply exploring his body, but were actively modifying it, making subtle changes that suggested they intended to establish a permanent presence rather than simply using him as a temporary breeding ground. Several of the organisms had returned to the tears in his arm and were secreting substances that appeared to be healing the damaged tissue while simultaneously restructuring it in ways that would accommodate their continued presence. The edges of the wounds were being sealed not with normal human healing, but with what appeared to be engineered tissue that incorporated elements from both human and creature biology, creating hybrid structures that would allow for easy passage between the interior and exterior of his body. Thomas watched in fascinated horror as his own arm was being transformed into something that was no longer entirely human, a gateway or interface that would allow these creatures to maintain their residence inside him while having access to the outside world whenever necessary. The precision and sophistication of this bioengineering exceeded anything in human medical science, suggesting that these organisms possessed knowledge of biological manipulation that could revolutionize medicine if it could be understood and replicated. But Thomas was not interested in the scientific implications of what was happening to him. He was focused on the growing realization that he was being permanently modified to serve as a host for intelligent parasites who had no intention of ever leaving his body. As the sun began to set over the Nebraska farmland, Thomas found himself changed in ways that went far beyond the physical modifications to his arm, transformed from a simple farmer into something unprecedented in human experience, a conscious participant in an interspecies relationship that challenged every assumption about biological boundaries and individual identity. The creatures had completed their emergence and modification of his arm, establishing what appeared to be a permanent colony site with sophisticated entry and exit points that could be sealed when necessary but opened for transit whenever required. Thomas could feel them moving inside his arm, not as foreign invaders but as permanent residents who had made themselves at home in his flesh and blood. The sensation was no longer disturbing but oddly comforting, as if he had gained new organs or capabilities that extended his awareness beyond the traditional boundaries of his own body. When he concentrated, he could sense what the creatures were sensing, feel their emotions and intentions, and even communicate with them through methods that bypassed spoken language entirely. The relationship was becoming truly symbiotic, with benefits flowing in both directions as Thomas gained access to sensory information and analytical capabilities far beyond human norms, while the creatures gained a mobile platform that could carry them anywhere they needed to go. The story of Thomas Garrett and his extraordinary infestation would eventually reach Dr. Harrison and the medical community, sparking debates about the nature of consciousness, individual identity, and the possibility of beneficial parasitic relationships that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology and the boundaries of self. But those discussions would come later, after Thomas had time to adapt to his new reality and understand the full implications of his transformation. As he walked back toward his farmhouse that evening, Rex finally approaching him with cautious curiosity rather than fear, Thomas realized that he was no longer the same person who had dismissed a simple bruise 3 weeks earlier. He had become something new and unprecedented, a human being who shared his body with intelligent creatures from an unknown origin, organisms that had chosen him as their partner in a relationship that promised to be more complex and rewarding than anything he had ever experienced with his own species. The lonely farmer who had thought he would spend his remaining years in isolation had instead become the first member of a new kind of family, one that transcended species boundaries and opened possibilities for human evolution that science fiction writers had barely imagined. Thomas smiled as he opened his kitchen door, feeling the gentle movement of his new companions beneath his skin, and wondered what adventures tomorrow would bring for this unprecedented partnership between human and unknown intelligence.